Thank you very much, Julian. Our next guest is Rowena Ironside. Rowena had a very successful career in software services prior to taking the Sloan program in 2002. Since when, she's built a portfolio of non-exec and advisor roles across private, public and voluntary sectors. I looked at that portfolio last night and it's highly varied. There's leading edge technology, there's dignity in dying, there's Cupcake Mum, and more recently, Rowena is co-founder and chair of Women in Boards, which exists to encourage, inform and connect women seeking leadership positions in both executive and non-executive capacities. So I'd like to welcome Rowena to talk to us about leadership and power in the age of information transparency. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Oh, we've moved on already. So a slight change of pace from Julian. And yes, my working title for today was From Eminence to Evidence, which is a phrase I picked up from a Freakonomics podcast called Bad Medicine, but I do actually think has applicability quite a bit more broadly across leadership contexts. And if any of you are fans of Freakonomics, you'll know that the founder, Steve Dubner, tells a really good story. And he started the Bad Medicine series with what he called the story of 98.6. And this is the widely held belief that we're only healthy if our body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 37 degrees centigrade. The scientific evidence behind this was established over 150 years ago by Dr. Karl Wunderlich using a thermometer that was a foot long, that is 30 centimeters, measured 2 degrees higher than other thermometers and could only be used under the arm. And there have been recent efforts to confirm this, and they took about 1 million temperatures and discovered that actually only 8% are 98.6 degrees. So the fact that so many healthcare decisions have been taken for so long based on this rather dubious evidence did appeal to my sense of humour. But I also believe that eminence-based leadership, which I would describe as power without adequate challenge and transparency, is a little bit too widespread and could be behind no small number of corporate and political disasters. And as I've always been intrigued by the psychology of leadership decision-making, what I'm going to do over the next 20 minutes is try and weave my personal Sloan transition story with a bit of what we're doing at Women on Boards within the theme of how ubiquitous access to information is forcing and enabling a shift towards more evidence-based decision-making. Sorry, I'm obviously pointing this at the wrong place. Oh. Move on. So my decision to enroll on the Sloan happened pretty quickly. It was precipitated by the dot-com bust and the imminent implosion of the data center company I was working for, and I gave no thought at all to what life would be like when I graduated, assuming, based on past success, that everything would fall into place pretty simply. What I learned, and can probably only really articulate now, is that when you're operating within the safety of an established career and a strong network, you're taking a lot of things for granted. Your job title and your networks are invisible accelerators, and you only realize how much they're doing for you when you lose them. So whereas pre-Sloan, most of us move effortlessly from one career challenge to the next, when we give up that big job title, and particularly if we change country to study, as so many Sloans do, the challenge of repositioning yourself afterwards to a bunch of strangers at the level you were operating at pre-Sloan is pretty excruciating, and doing it with search consultants is even worse in my experience. And part of the key to that challenge is your network, and in particular, people who know you, know what you can do, and will stand behind you. Looking at what I was doing pre and post Sloan, it falls naturally into a couple of main areas. There is the information technology and the interest in leadership, and then I've moved into governance and diversity. And I actually started university only 2 years after that video was taken of Arthur C. Clarke. So the computer room that I saw there looked remarkably similar to my university in Western Australia. And that was a great time to get into the industry. So I then spent the next 25 years at the leading edge of digital innovation as we moved literally from punch cards to internet data centers. However, my interest in how organizations worked led me to the conclusion pretty early on that even when you are on the bleeding edge of technology, the really difficult stuff is the people bit. Because in comparison to human beings, technology really is the simple bit. And because I was an IT consultant, I traveled all over the world. I worked in Japan, in Canada, in Brazil, in France, and of course in Silicon Valley. And working with all those different national cultures only deepened my interest in the difficulty of getting things done through people, which is actually one of the keys to leadership, without which the best strategy in the world is actually pretty worthless. So my own move into governance after the Sloan could probably be anticipated from my interest in leadership, but if you'd told me in my 30s that I was going to become a cheerleader for women, I would have been pretty skeptical, because like many successful women, particularly those of us who don't have children, I had no idea at all about the challenges that are faced still by the majority of women in the workplace. So looking back and creating a story of my pre and post Sloan, it almost sounds like there was a master plan. But like so many, it took quite a few years to rebuild that momentum that I'd so casually given up in 2001. And returning to the importance of networks, most of what I did for the first 10 years after the Sloan did actually come through my Sloan network, which took me from quite a narrow focus in the technology sector. I hadn't thought it was narrow at the time, but I moved into not-for-profit sector, into the public sector, and Julian mentioned Samantha Ghoshal. I did an elective with him, which inspired me about microfinance, so I was involved with a microfinance charity in Malawi, and also working with Prince Charles, who had a project around the link between rainforest destruction and climate change, and that was thanks to one of my cohort who somehow ended up working for the Prince. And as Alison touched on, I was also building my non-exec portfolio, which ranged from everything to the Dignity in Dying campaign to sitting on the governing body of one of the Cambridge colleges, which was actually quite fascinating because I had no prior links to Cambridge. And 16 years on, this eclectic mix of different activities has positioned me for some interesting roles and has even taken me back into fintech, where I'm the chair of the judging panel for Nesta's Open Up Challenge. And although we didn't call it that back in the 1980s when I was putting in the first online commodity trading system in the Tokyo Grain Exchange, it was actually what I was doing back then. So my final point about the Sloan program is that whereas to invest in a degree program now is still the exception, it is going to become much more important going forward. Despite the challenges of re-establishing your career post-Sloan, I think that all of you are going to look back on that investment in learning, and particularly in the network, as something that you are grateful for. And if we are going to survive the 100-year life, I think many more of us are going to be continuing with education throughout our career. And this is one of the big topics that Professor Linda Grattan talks about, as many of you will know. So for those of you who are currently in the valley of death, wondering why the hell you gave up that big salary, know that it probably wasn't as secure as it felt, and that in the long run you really will be convinced that this year at the Sloan has been worth it. And part of my own journey out of that valley of death was returning to my entrepreneurial roots, and Women on Boards is a startup that I helped found in the UK 6 years ago, and our mission is to get us to the point where boards and leadership teams in all sectors meet the 40-40-20 rule, which is 40% men, 40% women, and 20% we don't care. And back to that theme of transparency of data. Data is actually one of the things that's been a key part in our success, helping women gain access to roles that have been historically held by a pretty small elite. And as well as my entrepreneurial interest, I got involved with Women on Boards because I did finally realize in my 50s, better late than never, the staggering lack of women in top leadership roles. And I'm sure many of you are aware that still the percentage of female chief executives in the top companies in the US, the UK, Australia, and many other countries is still less than 10%, which clearly makes no sense given the number of years since men and women have been graduating at par with men, from universities. So what we did, we took advantage of an Australian business model and launched Women on Boards in September 2012, and I did a deep dive into the growing body of research around diversity and organizational success in order to try and understand myself what was going wrong in the talent pipeline. And as I looked at why organizations were struggling to retain their female talent and to build really diverse pipelines of senior leaders, I realized that part of the problem was the guys at the top didn't actually understand their data. They were very comfortable in their assumptions that the reason there were so few women sitting next to them was that the women had made other choices. Perhaps they weren't interested, perhaps they were too risk averse, or perhaps, as this kind of jaw-dropping quote from one of them that came out in the Financial Times was, these issues were just a bit too complicated for us. And needless to say, none of these assumptions are supported by the data. And the good news for anyone who does care about making sure that the best talent makes it to the top is that there is now a lot more information available to help challenge dated assumptions, including the available metrics, lots of publicly available metrics on the number of women on boards in top management, and more recently around pay differentials, lots of solid research showing that diverse leadership is associated with improved innovation, improved financial outcomes, and improved organizational success more broadly. And thirdly, and as importantly, a lot more people telling stories like me, whether it's about the myths of merit, whether it's about differential access to information, opportunities, networks, and sponsors between the in-crowds and minorities. So, based on this information about differential access to information, what Women on Boards does is actually quite simple. We do just provide information, encouragement, and connections to fill gaps that primarily women and other minorities have. And what are these gaps? Women are less likely to have a mate who's sitting on a board that they can talk to about the boardroom, which translates into they're more likely to assume they don't have the skills or they don't have the time. They are also less likely to have spent time developing their social capital and their strategic networks. And that is not least because they still do 70% of the unpaid work at home. And although some of this stuff may sound quite trivial, recent research shows that majority of board roles still go to someone who's already known to the headhunter or the board, even when they're publicly advertised. And translated, we get back to the point that your networks and your social capital are invisible accelerators to getting board roles. So you start to see how the absence of the right connections can severely handicap someone, and also how some fairly simple interventions, at least in terms of the boardroom, can make a big difference. But you do need the right interventions, and building inclusive cultures will be a long-term challenge because it actually isn't human nature. And even though, for example, a lot of organizations have been running unconscious bias training for quite a few years now, and I've seen a number of $8 billion spent in 1 year in the US about this, most of them aren't seeing a lot of change in diversity and inclusion outcomes. And that is because biases are almost impossible to change. And so the behavioral science indicates, and the research now does show, that if you want to get different outcomes from your recruitment and promotion, you actually have to change the structure of the decision-making processes within your organization. So I touched on the myths of merit earlier on, and I'm going to return to them now, and this is your chance to get interactive with my poll. So hopefully all of you remember how to use Slido. And my question is, do you believe that promotions in your organization always go to the best qualified individual? Okay. So I see that I'm not alone in being sceptical about the prevalence of true meritocracies. Many of you clearly have some insight into at least one of the myths of merit. And I've personally noticed fairly on in my career that there are a lot of people at the top of organisations who didn't appear to me to have many qualifications to be there. And this is one of the reasons why I became really interested in merit when the topic came up, because whenever people start talking about targets or, God forbid, quotas for gender diversity or any other type of diversity, almost everyone responds, I don't believe in those, I want to be recruited on merit. And so it is really important that more of us are able to articulate some of the misconceptions that underlie this idea of merit. And the first is that merit is an objective standard. We talk about it as if we would all recognise and agree on it, when in fact it lies in the eyes of the beholder and is strongly self-referential. So whilst we are all hiring and promoting people like us, we are still absolutely believing that we're doing it on merit. The second is this one about merit determines who gets to the top. And those of us who've spent time in large organisations kind of know instinctively that's not the whole story, as my poll results showed. But objectively, there was research done for the 30% Club in 2014 that showed that a man entering a law firm in London or New York was 10 times more likely to be promoted to partner than a woman. And in the other professional services, it was more like 3.5 times. So this really does underline the fact that it isn't simply how good you are and how hard you work that gets you to the top. Which leads me to the third myth, and this is the one a lot of people find the most uncomfortable, that women and men are competing on a level playing field, whereas in fact, gender stereotypes and unconscious bias are still prevalent throughout society and therefore in organisations, which does mean that they are continuing to limit the opportunities and the aspirations of women and girls. So, coming back to my theme of the future of leadership and evidence versus eminence, one of the things that excites me about the age of data transparency is the potential to improve leadership by shining a light into previously dark places. I have always hated unfairness and abuse of power, but the fact is the potential for both is a part of human nature, so they are not at all uncommon in organisations. But the good news is that the best antidote to both has always been exposure, which has become so much easier in the age of the internet, social media, and also changing attitudes. Because what we're seeing now is that whether it is corruption, whether it's pay discrimination, whether it's sexual harassment, people are prepared to speak out. And there's a real moving moral boundary about what is acceptable. So whereas it may be wishful thinking, I believe there's a potential for the race to the top, where the best talent does vote with their feet and choose organisations with ethical and transparent leadership. And then the second thing that excites me about data proliferation is the impetus it gives to decentralising leadership. And this is one of the things that Julian touched on. But hierarchy and bureaucracy are deeply entrenched in many organisations, even quite small ones, and they stifle creativity and aspiration and are well past their sell-by date in many sectors. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the concept of shared leadership and humble leadership, and they call it squadification at Spotify. But the important breakthrough for me is this understanding that the best decisions will often come from the edge and not the centre. That's the real shift. And as Julian outlined, in this pace, with the pace of change and increasing global competition, it is a matter of survival for organisations to become less hierarchical, less bureaucratic, and more responsive to changing customer preferences, which can only really be done with more agile structures and with decision-making closer to the edge. Now, dismantling hierarchies and busting bureaucracy won't be easy because, of course, human beings and organisations have this inbuilt resistance to change, but I expect at least some of you heard a recent broadcast at London Business School review that Julian did with Professor Gary Hamill, who is actually running trials on ways to deinstall bureaucracy. And because you can't do this top-down, what they are doing is they are crowdsourcing management hacks from within the organization about how to tackle this bureaucracy. And I think they came up with about 900 and are trialing 25 or 45 at the moment. So promising results in that area. So in conclusion, on the future of leadership, what I believe is that the power of big data, I'll call it, to democratize decision-making and to shine that light is a strong force for raising the bar in leadership, and I think in that way strengthening society and democracy. Thank you. Sorry, I'm not mic'd up, but you can probably hear me anyway. How would you advise organisations on the link between women and broader leadership diversity? Often we face criticism for focusing on just women for metrics. Yes, I mean, clearly I am focusing just on women because it is the biggest majority. I believe that once we start shifting mindsets and in particular making these changes to organisational processes, it will benefit everyone. The challenge we are dealing with is an organisational culture which for a lot of historical reasons was built by men for men, and it just doesn't work for other minorities, but even in this age. So as we start to change organisational cultures, and with the type of changes Julian was talking about, my hope is that this will feed through. And I do think the work in understanding diversity and inclusion more broadly, people are understanding it in a broader sense. How would you advise organisations on the link between women and broader... Hang on, that's the one I've done. How can we help? How can we get involved? Okay. Talk to me later. I think one of the most important things is just understanding that it is still going wrong, that there are still these stereotypes and biases. I have them myself, and knowing that there are things that can be done. How can leaders fight that top down? This stuff only changes in organisations if leaders get it and if they feel it's important. To me, the core is talent. And as the world becomes more competitive, if you're not getting your best talent through, then at the end of the day, your organisation is not going to win. And so I think if you make the link for people with what is in it for them, that is the best way that you can change within organisations. I mean, when I was running larger organisations, it was always about people's incentives. So tying people's KPIs to changing in this area is clearly going to be one of them. Good. I think that is my time to move on. Thank you, everyone. Just one thing I'd say in parting. Don't forget the critical importance of your networks, and don't underestimate the value of becoming a Sloan alumni, because it means you are now part of a program and a network backed by 3 great schools, and you can call on that network anywhere in the world.